The neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates shimmered under the summer sun, its manicured lawns and pristine driveways a testament to the iron grip of the Homeowners Association. Nestled in a quiet suburban corner, the community was a picture of order, flower beds trimmed to perfection, mailboxes painted in uniform taupe, and not a single blade of grass daring to grow beyond regulation height. At the heart of this meticulously curated world stood Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, a woman whose name alone could make residents lower their gazes and quicken their steps. Margaret, in her late 50s, carried herself with the authority of a monarch, her sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood for infractions, her clipboard an extension of her will. She was the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek's aesthetic, a tyrant cloaked in pastel cardigans and sensible loafers, ruling with a fervor that bordered on obsession. For years, Margaret's reign had gone unchallenged. Her rules were law. Fences could be no taller than 4 feet. Holiday decorations had to be removed by January 5th, and any exterior paint color required her personal approval. Violations were met with swift fines, stern letters, and, in extreme cases, liens on properties. Residents whispered about her in hushed tones, sharing stories of her relentless pursuit of compliance. One family had been fined for a basketball hoop left up overnight. Another faced a lien for planting unapproved azaleas. Margaret's power seemed absolute, her authority unquestioned, until the arrival of David and Emily Carter. David and Emily had moved into Willow Creek 6 months prior, seeking a quiet haven after years of city life. David, a soft-spoken software engineer in his early 40s, was drawn to the neighborhood's serene streets and spacious homes. Emily, his wife, was a former attorney whose sharp mind had once dominated courtrooms. A car accident 5 years earlier had left her with chronic pain and mobility issues, confining her to a wheelchair on most days. Despite her physical limitations, her intellect remained razor-sharp, her legal acumen undiminished. The couple had chosen a modest two-story home on Maple Lane, its ramped entrance a necessity for Emily's independence. They envisioned a peaceful life, a place to rebuild after years of medical battles and career upheavals. But Willow Creek, under Margaret's watchful eye, was no sanctuary. Trouble began almost immediately. The Carters' home, though well maintained, bore small deviations from HOA standards. Their mailbox, a sleek black design, clashed with the neighborhood's mandated taupe. A small garden of wildflowers, planted by Emily to bring color to their front yard, violated the HOA-approved plant list. David received the first violation notice within a week of moving in, a crisp letter detailing the infractions and demanding immediate correction. He complied, repainting the mailbox and uprooting the wildflowers, though the act pained Emily, who found solace in their vibrant hues. But Margaret's scrutiny only intensified. She seemed to take personal offense to the Carters' presence, as if their very existence challenged her dominion. Margaret's visits to Maple Lane became a near-daily ritual. She would stride up to the Carters' property, clipboard in hand, noting every perceived infraction: a wheelchair ramp that was unsightly, a porch light that was too modern, even a bird feeder deemed excessively large. Each notice carried a fine, and the fines piled up quickly. David, ever the peacemaker, tried to reason with Margaret, attending HOA meetings to plead their case. But Margaret's responses were cold, her tone dripping with condescension. She saw the Carters as outsiders, disruptors of her perfect order, and she was determined to bring them into line or drive them out. Emily, though, was not one to be cowed. From her wheelchair, she observed Margaret's campaign with a quiet intensity, her legal mind cataloguing every interaction, every letter, every fine. She spent evenings poring over the HOA bylaws, a dense document filled with arcane rules and loopholes. David urged her to let it go, to avoid the stress, but Emily's resolve only hardened. She saw Margaret not just as a bully, but as a puzzle to be solved, a system to be dismantled. Her years in the courtroom had taught her to spot weaknesses in even the most formidable opponents, and Margaret, for all her bluster, was no exception. The tipping point came in late spring, when Margaret issued a notice threatening a lien on the Carters' home. The cited violation was the wheelchair ramp, which Margaret claimed violated aesthetic guidelines and lowered property values. The notice demanded its removal within 30 days or face legal action. David was livid, his usual calm fraying at the edges. The ramp was not just a convenience but a necessity, a lifeline for Emily's independence. To remove it would be to strip her of her autonomy, to confine her to the house. Emily, however, remained calm, her eyes gleaming with a determination David hadn't seen since her days in the courtroom. She told him to let Margaret proceed, to let her escalate the matter. Emily had a plan, and it began with letting the tyrant overplay her hand. Margaret, emboldened by her unchallenged authority, pushed forward with zeal. She rallied the HOA board, a group of spineless neighbors who nodded along to her every decree. They approved the lien and prepared to take the Carters to court, a move Margaret saw as the ultimate assertion of her power. She envisioned a swift victory, a public humiliation that would cement her control over Willow Creek. Notices were sent, legal documents filed, and a court date set. Margaret spent weeks preparing, her confidence unshakable. She saw Emily as a frail, disabled woman, an easy target for her wrath. She could not have been more wrong. Emily, meanwhile, was in her element. Her days were spent in the study, surrounded by legal texts, HOA bylaws, and case law. She cross-referenced every rule Margaret had cited, uncovering inconsistencies and procedural errors. The HOA-owned documents became her weapons, each clause a potential chink in Margaret's armor. David watched in awe as Emily worked, her focus unbroken despite the pain that often clouded her days. She was not just fighting for their home, but for every resident who had suffered under Margaret's tyranny. The courtroom, she knew, would be her battlefield, and she was ready to wage war. As the court date approached, tension hung over Willow Creek like a storm cloud. Neighbors whispered about the upcoming hearing, some secretly hoping the Carters would prevail, others too afraid of Margaret to voice their support. Margaret, oblivious to the growing unease, strutted through the neighborhood with renewed vigor, her clipboard a scepter of her imagined invincibility. She had no idea that Emily was preparing to turn her world upside down, that the woman she dismissed as weak was about to expose her for the petty tyrant she was. The morning of the hearing dawned bright and warm, the courthouse a looming presence in the nearby town. David pushed Emily's wheelchair up the ramp to the entrance, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Emily, dressed in a sharp blazer, her hair neatly pinned, radiated a quiet confidence. Inside, Margaret waited, her lips curled in a smug smile, unaware that she was walking into a trap of her own making. The stage was set, the players in place, and the battle for Willow Creek was about to begin. The courthouse in the heart of the nearby town stood as a monument to justice, its stone facade and towering columns, exuding an air of solemn authority. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the wooden benches of the courtroom filled with a smattering of Willow Creek residents who had come to witness the clash between the Carters and the indomitable Margaret Hensley. The room buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that precedes a storm, as neighbors exchanged glances, their loyalties divided between fear of Margaret's wrath and a quiet hope that someone might finally challenge her reign. The judge's bench loomed at the front, a polished mahogany sentinel, while the American and state flags flanked it, their colors muted under the fluorescent lights. David wheeled Emily to the plaintiff's table, his hands steady despite the knot of anxiety in his chest. Emily, her posture upright despite the pain that gnawed at her, arranged her notes with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Margaret sat across the aisle, her posture rigid, her eyes glinting with the confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. The case had begun as a simple dispute over a wheelchair ramp, but it had ballooned into a broader assault on the Carters' right to remain in Willow Creek. Margaret, as the HOA representative, had escalated the matter to a full-blown legal challenge, claiming the ramp violated aesthetic standards and devalued the neighborhood. She had bolstered her case with a litany of other supposed infractions: approved paint colors, an improperly placed bird feeder, even the angle of the ramp itself, all meticulously documented in her ever-present clipboard. To her, this was not just about compliance, but about asserting her dominance, proving that no one, not even a newcomer with a disability, could defy her vision for Willow Creek. Her legal team, a pair of local attorneys accustomed to handling small town disputes, had prepared a case heavy on HOA bylaws and light on empathy, confident that the judge would see the Carters as troublemakers. Emily, however, saw through the facade. Her years as a trial lawyer had honed her ability to dissect arguments, to find the cracks in even the most polished presentations. She had spent weeks preparing, her study a fortress of legal texts, case precedents, and the HOA's own labyrinthine bylaws. She had uncovered a pattern of overreach in Margaret's enforcement, a trail of procedural missteps that could unravel the HOA case. The bylaws, though dense, were riddled with ambiguities, and Margaret's zealous application of them had often strayed into illegality. Emily had also researched the Americans with Disabilities Act, knowing that the ramp was not just a matter of aesthetics, but a federally protected necessity. Her strategy was clear. She would let Margaret's arrogance be her undoing, allowing the tyrant to overextend herself before striking with surgical precision. As the hearing began, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Clara Thompson, called the room to order. Her reputation for fairness was well known, but so was her impatience for theatrics. Margaret's attorneys opened with a barrage of accusations, painting the Carters as reckless newcomers who disregarded community standards. They presented photographs of the ramp, the mailbox, the wildflower garden, each framed as an affront to Willow Creek's pristine image. Margaret sat smugly, her arms crossed, nodding along as her lawyers described the Carters' home as a blight on the neighborhood. The residents in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some sympathizing with the Carters but too intimidated to show it. David felt a surge of anger, his hands tightening on the arms of his chair, but Emily remained composed, her eyes fixed on the opposing counsel, her mind cataloging every word. When it was Emily's turn to present, she wheeled herself to the front of the courtroom, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding despite her physical limitations. She began not with emotion but with facts, laying out the HOA bylaws with a clarity that made even the most arcane clauses accessible. She pointed out inconsistencies in Margaret's enforcement, how the ramp's alleged violation had been cited under a vague aesthetic clause that lacked specific measurements or standards. She cited case law referencing local and federal precedents that protected accessibility modifications under the ADA. Her argument was methodical, each point building on the last, weaving a narrative of overreach and discrimination. The judge's expression, initially neutral, began to shift, her brow furrowing as Emily exposed the flimsiness of the HOA case. Margaret, however, was undeterred. During a recess, she approached the Carter's table, her voice low but dripping with venom. She mocked Emily's condition, suggesting that a real resident would have known better than to challenge the HOA. David's face flushed with rage, but Emily's calm demeanor held him back. She saw Margaret's taunts for what they were, a desperate attempt to provoke, to distract from the crumbling foundation of her case. Emily's response was not in words, but in her preparation, her mind already several steps ahead. She knew Margaret's outburst would only deepen the hole the HOA president was digging for herself. As the hearing resumed, Emily shifted her focus to the broader pattern of Margaret's behavior. She presented evidence of other residents who had faced similar harassment, fines for minor infractions, threats of liens for trivial deviations. She had gathered affidavits from neighbors, carefully anonymized to protect them from retaliation, detailing Margaret's authoritarian tactics. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling through the crowd as residents recognized their own stories in Emily's words. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her interest piqued, as Emily argued that the HOA actions were not just about one ramp, but about a systemic abuse of power. She cited legal precedents where HOA had been penalized for discriminatory practices, drawing parallels to Margaret's campaign against the Carters. Margaret's attorneys scrambled to counter, but their arguments faltered. They leaned heavily on the bylaws, but Emily had already exposed their weaknesses. They tried to dismiss the Ada claims, arguing that the ramp's design was a choice, not a necessity, but Emily's documentation of her medical needs silenced that line of attack. The courtroom grew tense, the balance tipping as Emily dismantled the HOA case piece by piece. Margaret's smugness began to crack, her fingers drumming nervously on the table, her eyes darting to her lawyers as if demanding they fix the unraveling situation. By the end of the day, the courtroom was a study in contrasts. Emily, though physically frail, radiated an intellectual strength that filled the room. Margaret, once the unchallenged queen of Willow Creek, looked smaller, her confidence eroded by the weight of Emily's arguments. The judge adjourned the hearing, scheduling the final session for the following week. As David wheeled Emily out of the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps, a symbolic end to the day's battle. The residents dispersed, their whispers now tinged with excitement, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Margaret lingered in the courtroom, her clipboard forgotten on the table, her mind racing to salvage her position. Back in Willow Creek, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Word of Emily's performance spread, emboldening some residents to share their own grievances in hushed conversations over backyard fences. Margaret, sensing the shift, doubled down, issuing new violation notices to quell the dissent. but her actions only fueled the growing unrest, as neighbors began to see her not as a protector of standards, but as a bully clinging to power. Emily, in her study, continued her work, preparing for the final confrontation. She knew the battle was far from over, that Margaret would fight to the end. But Emily was ready, her legal brilliance a beacon in the gathering storm, poised to bring the tyrant to her knees. The final day of the court hearing dawned with a crisp autumn chill, the air in Willow Creek Estates heavy with anticipation. The neighborhood, once a bastion of rigid conformity under Margaret Hensley's iron rule, now hummed with a quiet rebellion. Word of Emily Carter's commanding performance in the courtroom had spread like wildfire, igniting hope among residents who had long suffered under the HOA oppressive regulations. The courthouse, a familiar sentinel of justice, stood ready to host the climax of the battle that had gripped the community. Inside, the gallery was packed, more neighbors than ever crowding the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and cautious optimism. David wheeled Emily into the courtroom, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos she was about to unleash. Her notes were meticulously organized, her expression serene yet resolute, a warrior armed with intellect rather than steel. Across the aisle, Margaret sat rigid, her pastel cardigan a thin veneer over her fraying composure. The tyrant of Willow Creek was cornered, and she knew it, though her pride refused to admit defeat. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity in the neighborhood. Margaret, sensing the tide turning against her, had doubled down on her campaign of control. Violation notices flooded mailboxes, targeting even the most compliant residents, fines for slightly faded shutters, warnings for unapproved lawn ornaments, threats of legal action for minor infractions. Her desperation was palpable, her clipboard a frantic shield against the growing dissent. But her actions only fueled the fire Emily had sparked. Neighbors, emboldened by the Carters' defiance, began to speak openly, sharing stories of Margaret's overreach in hushed gatherings at the community park. Some even slipped anonymous tips to Emily, detailing years of harassment and questionable HOA practices. Emily absorbed it all, her legal mind weaving these threads into a tapestry of evidence that would unravel Margaret's empire. In the courtroom, Judge Clara Thompson took her seat, her stern gaze sweeping over the packed gallery. The atmosphere was electric, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Margaret's attorneys opened with a final attempt to salvage their case, doubling down on the HOA bylaws and framing the Carters as disruptors who threatened the neighborhood's harmony. They presented new photographs, hastily taken, of the Carters' ramp, arguing its unsightly design justified their demands for removal, but their arguments were tired, repetitive, lacking the vigor of their earlier presentations. The gallery sensed the weakness, their murmurs growing bolder as the lawyers stumbled over Emily's earlier points about ADA protections and procedural errors. When Emily took the floor, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. She wheeled herself to the center, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding. She began by dismantling the HOA latest claims, pointing out that the photographs were misleading, taken from angles that exaggerated the ramp's impact. She presented architectural drawings, sourced from a neighbor who was a retired engineer, showing that the ramp met all safety and accessibility standards. Her voice, though calm, carried a weight that filled the room, each word a carefully placed stone in the edifice of her argument. She transitioned seamlessly to the broader issue of Margaret's leadership, revealing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that violated not only the spirit of the HOA, but also state and federal laws. Emily's evidence was a masterclass in legal precision. She presented a timeline of Margaret's actions, cross-referenced with the HOA bylaws, showing how the president had selectively enforced rules to target specific residents. She introduced affidavits from neighbors, their identities protected but their stories damning, families fined for minor deviations, elderly residents bullied into compliance, even a single mother threatened with a lien over a child's tricycle left in a driveway. Each piece of evidence built on the last, painting a picture of an HOA run not for the community's benefit but for Margaret's ego. Emily cited case law, drawing parallels to other HOA that had faced legal consequences for similar abuses. She invoked the Fair Housing Act, arguing that the attempt to remove her ramp was not just an aesthetic dispute, but a clear violation of her rights as a disabled person. The gallery was riveted, the residents hanging on Emily's every word. Even Judge Thompson, known for her impassive demeanor, leaned forward, her pen pausing as she absorbed the scope of Emily's argument. Margaret's face grew paler with each point, her fingers clutching her clipboard so tightly the knuckles turned white. Her attorneys tried to interject, raising objections, but Emily's responses were swift and unyielding, each rebuttal grounded in legal precedent. She exposed the HOA failure to provide proper notice for the lien, a procedural misstep that rendered their entire case legally void. She highlighted Margaret's lack of transparency in board meetings, revealing minutes that had been doctored to obscure dissenting votes. The courtroom became a stage for Emily's brilliance, her disability no longer a point of mockery, but a testament to her resilience. As Emily concluded, she turned her attention directly to Margaret, not with anger, but with a measured clarity that cut deeper than any outburst could. She argued that the HOA, under Margaret's leadership, had lost its purpose, becoming a tool of control rather than a guardian of community standards. She called for the court to not only dismiss the case against the Carters, but to issue an injunction against the HOA discriminatory practices. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some residents nodding in agreement, others exchanging shocked glances. Margaret's attorneys scrambled to respond, but their arguments collapsed under the weight of Emily's evidence. The judge called for a recess, her expression unreadable, but the room buzzed with the sense that a reckoning was imminent. During the break, Margaret's composure shattered. She paced the courthouse hallway, her usual air of authority replaced by a frantic energy. She muttered to her attorneys, demanding they find a way to counter Emily's onslaught, but they had little to offer. The residents, meanwhile, gathered in clusters, their whispers turning to open discussions about Margaret's reign. Some expressed regret for staying silent, others vowed to support the Carters if the case went their way. David watched it all from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride as he saw the impact of Emily's work. She sat quietly, reviewing her notes, her calm a stark contrast to the chaos around her. When the court reconvened, Judge Thompson delivered her ruling with a gravity that silenced the room. She dismissed the HOA case against the Carters, citing their failure to follow proper procedures and their violation of federal accessibility laws. She went further, issuing an injunction that barred the HOA from enforcing aesthetic rules against accessibility modifications without clear, non-discriminatory justification. She ordered a review of the HOA practices, mandating transparency in future board actions. The gallery erupted in a mix of gasps and applause, the sound echoing off the courtroom walls. Margaret sat frozen, her clipboard abandoned, her empire crumbling in real time. As the gavel fell, the residents of Willow Creek streamed out of the courthouse, their voices a chorus of relief and excitement. Margaret slipped away, her head bowed, her authority shattered. The Carters returned home to a neighborhood transformed. Neighbors who had once avoided them now stopped by, offering thanks and sharing their own stories of Margaret's tyranny. The HOA board, chastened by the court's ruling, began the process of reform, with new elections looming to replace Margaret's loyalists. Emily, though exhausted, felt a quiet triumph, her legal brilliance having not only saved their home but freed a community from fear. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek began to heal. The wildflower garden was replanted, the ramp stood proud, and the neighborhood buzzed with a new sense of possibility. Margaret, stripped of her power, faded into the background, her clipboard a relic of a bygone era. Emily and David settled into their home, no longer outsiders but heroes of a quiet revolution. The sun set over Maple Lane, casting a warm glow on a community reborn, its future brighter than ever.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.